Welcome to today's version of Curated Insights with Seth Dechtman. Our special guest is Kim Lear. Kim, thank you for being with us today. Hello.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is great to be with you. You know, we do have not only some history in working together and you presenting to my clients, but we both studied on the same overseas program. And it's, I think, a unique link that you might not have with other bureaus and agencies that you've worked with, I'm sure.
So true.
So true. So today we're going to talk about all things that you study, that you comprise of the work that you do every day, not just in your speaking. But I want to go right in. I don't know if it's the deep end necessarily, but I want to just dig in right from the beginning. What does it mean to grow older today?
Oh, we're going right there.
Big question, but here's where you can go wherever you want with it. You can break it down by the generations. You can break it down into COVID. You can break it down where we can start with that and go deep. But I just want to open it up with that.
Well, I think the whole conversation of what does it mean to grow old now? How is that different than what it meant to grow old 20, 30 years ago, farther than that?
Sure.
And what could it mean to grow old in the future it's one of the most interesting things to me. And I think people who are not engaged in this conversation about aging it's crazy to me because the only thing we all have in common is we are all aging all the time. That's what we have in common. So during the pandemic, myself and my colleagues, we conducted these interviews with people throughout the pandemic, creating this time capsule. And initially, when we started on this project, we were thinking that our conversation with the 55 plus demographic would maybe be our most emotional just because the nature of the virus disproportionately impacts them. And there were some devastating stories.
Sure.
But I was surprised at how so many of the most inspiring stories that we captured were from the 55 plus demographic, because what it means to age looks different. And that gap between lifespan and health span is really beginning to shrink, which is great. And so there were a lot of people who had this moment of forced reinvention. We have a lot of baby boomers who are still really active in the workplace, but even the ones who are not, they are hungry for intellectual stimulation, and they have the time now that maybe they didn't to really engage in their curiosities. And they wanted to still see their kids and their grandkids and their friends. And so they adapted to new technology at a really fast speed. And just, we live in such an ageist society, one that tells us that we cannot teach an old dog new tricks. And that was really never true. But then a pandemic hit, which forced reinvention. And this story about aging, it was already changing. And there's just this young at heart mindset. And in an age of longevity, you had to reinvent. People can only golf for so long. Like, golf is not that fun. And so we had to reimagine, what does it mean to grow older? How can we do this in a way with dignity and to still have this purpose-driven life? And I think a lot of people experimented with that during the pandemic, and it was a really amazing thing to see.
Yeah. And you just said a phrase there, purpose-driven life, Kim. It's like having something that has meaning and something that has a significance that you're engaged with. Because frankly, people are living older. Is that accurate from what I've read?
People are living longer. I mean, there's a lot of nuances to longevity data. White people are living significantly longer in America than Black people, living longer than the Hispanic and Latino populations. And so, there's nuances to what we see with longevity. But the trend overall, even though there are these big gaps, it is ticking upward. It is longer.
Right.
Yeah.
And
But I also think that kind of that big push in this next era of health and wellness is going to be shrinking the lifespan health span gap. And
talk a little bit about the lifespan health span. I mean, I can deduce what I think it means, but would you share with us how you would define that?
Well, I'll give you a great example is that there's a statistic that came out of Dr. James Paul at Harvard, a demographer, who said that about 50% of children born in the year 2007 will live to be 104. And I remember in a presentation when I shared that data, and the room overwhelmingly was like, no. Like, that is too old, that's too
Ah,
long. And
right.
part of the reason is you have people today in their 60s and 70s, and they watched the way that their parents went, and dementia and Alzheimer's, where physically they were kept alive, but
Yeah.
mentally they were no longer there. And you talk to 60-year-olds who had to see that, who had to experience that, and they're like, I won't go that way.
Right.
And that is the lifespan health span gap. And there's also this conversation about like a thrive span. How long can you actually live a fulfilling life? Living a long time doesn't actually matter if that life is purposeless and dissatisfying. And so I think that's where a lot of the attention is going to be in wellness, well-being, and healthcare is making life worth living longer.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Because there's the physical, the health piece of it where, I mean, cognitive decline, from what I've seen, is the third biggest killer in North America. And in Great Britain, it's number one. And I only know that because one of the speakers I work with, Dale Bredesen, wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's.
Okay.
And he's more about protocol. There's really he doesn't, he's not manufacturing a drug or testing a drug. It's a holistic approach. And cognitive decline is a big killer. And
Yeah.
to your point of what you're saying is that, I'm an Xer. My mother's 85. She still drives. She goes 3 months in the winter down to Mexico. She works part-time at the elementary school in her neighborhood. Very, very vital. And there's a fulfillment. And so in addition to the health piece of it, you're saying that purpose driven is the phrase you use, and bringing meaning to it, because if you're 104 and you're playing cards and golf, that might not be enough to have you experience vitality and love and affinity day-to-day life.
And your mom is so lucky, and it's so wonderful to hear that. I mean, lucky, but also, I mean, I'm sure that she went out and sought these opportunities. But there is also a conversation, especially here in America, of in an age of longevity, even though there are some individuals like your mom who have really redefined how they're going to grow old and how they're going to avoid isolation and loneliness and how they're going to find purpose.
Right.
Overwhelmingly, our society has not done a good job of figuring out what to do with
Yeah.
elders. Right? If,
Yeah.
if we're going to be older for longer, then we also have to reimagine for all of us, like, what can those years look
Yeah.
like?
Yeah.
And that there's that element also because there's only so many volunteer opportunities.
Right.
And it's stuff like that of thinking about how do we incorporate elders into everyday society in a meaningful way that is good for everyone and good for them.
And it's not an easy answer, and I don't think that there's one answer. Often I've heard, well, they could be business advisors or educational
Mm.
advisors, and sure, there's a great rich resource there, but how do you deploy that? How do you make it work for the aging population and for those that could benefit from their experience, and how do you find a way to make that something that both sides of the coin there can benefit from? And not only that, Kim, but people are working longer, and all these facilities, whether it's assisted living or facilities like that, from what I understand, that's an expanding part of the healthcare system as well.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. But even a trend like that, I think it'll be really interesting to when we think about what would it mean to grow old in the future. Are we going to see more aging at home? One of the things that was so interesting about the pandemic is when I asked people of all generations, I would ask, what was your biggest silver lining of this time? And the runaway answer was more time with my family. And we saw a lot of people who have aging parents and they didn't want them in a senior living facility at this time because of safety issues and things like that. And they moved to where they are and they took them in. When we look at millennials and how many millennials moved home after the recession, there is this kind of interesting reciprocity that could happen where you had a lot of young adults who experienced their young adulthood era at home with their parents. And so perhaps for their parents, they would want to give that back to them and have them, aging at home. And so, but there's a lot of great benefits to a senior living facility. Again, when we talk about things like avoiding loneliness and isolation,
Right.
but
Community.
community, of course, but we look at other cultures where it is more of a multi-generational family unit that lives together,
Right.
and there are so many benefits to that as well, and so there's a chance that out of this pandemic, something that happens are these close-knit family units. And then it is this question of, are these family units going to feel comfortable sending their loved ones to a home after
Right.
going through this together?
Right. I mean, so the pandemic created that opportunity where
Yeah.
families are close knit. I mean, it happened with myself. My in laws, they're actually moving to Israel in December. They're in their late 70s, and they decided that they want to be, one of their children lives in Jerusalem and they want to be there, and they're moving in with him and his wife and the two daughters and the dog and everybody. And I don't know if the pandemic, if the pandemic didn't happen, if there would have been a context like for that kind of change. Do you think, I know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think that it's a trend, it's a tendency that's going to take hold, or is it still, the jury's still out?
The whole concept of aging at home was something that was discussed before the pandemic, and a lot of that having to do with technology, making it much more viable for people to age at home. And also before the pandemic, there were these other trends that were impacting the idea of more multi-generational living. One of them being this rise in dual income households and
Right.
egalitarian marriages, where when you have more households where there's not one person that is in charge of just the kids and the domestic life, then before the pandemic, kids also got sick all the time. Right? Like I have two preschoolers, and it's like
Right.
kids are sick. And if it isn't one person's sole responsibility to be home with the kids, those childcare disruptions can
Don't I
be
know it?
really derailing to a career. And so even before that, we were seeing grandparents taking a much larger role in caretaking responsibilities for their grandchildren. And so I think, and this sounds so trite to even say now, but I do feel like this is so true, that COVID really served as a personal disruptor, but a societal accelerator. A lot of these trends that we were already seeing, this closeness in family units, these really strong multi-generational family units, grandparents playing bigger roles in the lives of their grandchildren. This was already happening and then accelerated by the pandemic.
Yeah. And, I read your blog, Being Young in the Pandemic.
Yeah.
And while I feel young at heart, I think were you talking about millennials or even Gen
Gen
Z? Which generation were you referring to in that particular writing?
Gen Z, yeah,
Gen
college
Z, right.
students. Yeah.
And one of the takeaways was that, there was a lot more family time, which is to your point of what you were talking about. Tell us a little bit more about some of the points from that, the loss of ritual, things slow down a little bit, and
Yeah.
unendings.
Yeah, the pandemic has such profound impacts on all of us in ways that we won't really be able to digest for years. We'll look back on this time and there will be things that we miss. There will be things that we almost, block out of our minds because it was
Yeah,
so awful. But I do think for young people who are coming of age against this backdrop, it's a different experience because just they're so porous. They're at an age where they're just trying to figure out what they think about the world around them. It's typically a time of so much experimentation, right? They're trying to move away from who they were within their family structure, who their childhood group of friends told them they were. You're meant in many ways to be out in the world trying to
yeah,
shape your
yeah,
adult identity.
yeah,
And doing that in your childhood bedroom, it's very, very hard. And one of the things that I write about it is this unceremonious catapult into adulthood. And rites of passage have been written about since biblical times. There are reasons why there are these little markers that say, okay, now you're an adult or now you're a soldier
that's
or whatever
right.
that. And so to put young people out there into the world and all of a sudden they're no longer students and now they are workers or, whatever that change was, and do it without these traditional markers, that will have lingering impacts on the way that they grow up, the way that they see themselves, things like that. So I think that piece of it was something that made me sad. But on the flip side, I'll say that they're so resilient. And in that article, I shared some stories from young people who just shared
Yeah,
these amazing stories with me where I'm talking to them and I'm like, oh my, I think I would
right,
just be like, I don't know if I have that type of grit. Like I was
right.
amazed.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I read a few of them, and I got to tell you, Here's what made me think, apart from the resilience and the grit and the agility and the flexibility, the ability to just get on with it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it also a case of they don't know what they don't know? So it's like, as much as porous as they are and they're sponges and absorbing everything, they're not completely conscious of that, hey, I'm about to go through this rite of passage that's a marker.
Yeah.
Kind of, do they have a context from which to say, oh, I'm missing that?
I mean, you're not really nostalgic for moments that you've never had.
Right.
So, right, in that way, no. In that way it's okay. But they are aware. And I'll give you sort of an interesting example for any of you who are watching this. You may remember if you went to a, traditional four-year university. Typically who you become friends with first semester freshman year, these are usually not your like lifetime friends. A
Right,
lot of
right.
times the changes in friend circles between freshman year and senior year are really big because freshman
Yeah,
year you're kind of in that a little bit desperation mode where you're like, I will be friends with anyone who will be friends with me.
right.
And it's very geographical where it's like, okay, who lives next to me in my dorm? And then these friendships are created.
Exactly.
I think something that was interesting to me was that when I started this interview series with college freshmen, and now I'll speak to them every year for 6 years. So I've already done that year 2 interview cycle. So they're going into junior year and they're basically friends with the people who they made friends with first semester freshman year. And so I did
Wow.
hear a lot of stories about some drama in friend circles and things like that, just because they don't have that ability to. A lot of them were in pods, right? They were in these safety pods of like, these are the people
Right.
who we're going to see and will get tested once a week and whatever that is. And they do know that that's not normal. Like they will say things
Yeah,
like,
that
I
makes sense.
imagined that my college experience, I would be in clubs and I'd meet people in classes and my group of friends would sort of evolve over my years at university. And a lot of them don't have that experience. And so they are aware of those types of things where they're like, I know that this is not normal.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe even just a few years ago, their older brother or sister or sibling or a cousin had all of these experiences that they were saying, "Man, I can't wait! I'm so excited to be able to do that,"
Right.
and kind of disappear from the panorama, if you will, at least
Yeah.
momentarily. So I want to, given that we're going to be doing a lot of this on LinkedIn, a lot of these clips. I want to talk a little bit about the changing workforce, for the
Yeah.
workers, the employees, and for those hiring. Just want to have a general kind of conversation around the open kind of freelance work ecosystem, the human
Okay.
cloud, the generations, and all within this. I think of you, I think of the generational behaviors.
Mm.
And I think it would be really interesting to have your take on those generational behaviors inside of the changing workforce. I personally, as an Xer who is very independent, is that one of our traits, I think?
Yeah.
um, I'm using freelancers and it's new for me. And I've had them for about a year and it's still a challenge for me to grow and open myself up to, all of, what it takes to manage a team of freelancers. So share with us, what's happening inside the workforce during the pandemic that, could provide some insights.
Yeah, so every generation, every person has there are aspects of this hybrid workplace that will be really exciting and huge pros for them and big cons. And most of that really has to do with where people are at in their life cycle, right? Which life stage that they are in. So with baby boomers, it's been really interesting to talk to them about this transition into remote work. And again, because we live in this really ageist society, I do see so many articles where they're like, baby boomers all want to come back into the office and they like hate remote work. Or if you actually look at the data that is currently available, people are really meeting in a very similar place about how often they actually want to be in the workplace in person. And it lands at around 2 to 3 days a week. And so we're seeing that kind of across the board. So with baby boomers, one of the things that I've heard quite a bit from the ones who really do like working from home is some of them have spouses who are already retired. And so they weren't really able to travel with them. They weren't able to exercise that
Right.
like spontaneity. And now they can. And it's awesome. I've talked to a lot of older workers where their kids live in different states. And because of PTO policies and very limited work from home, they didn't get to spend a lot of time with them. And now they do. And so there are a ton of pros to remote work that people across generations are really liking. I will say that when I do hear things like older workers want everyone to come back into the workplace 5 days a week, I believe that some of that is due to it's an element of generational hazing in some ways, totally subconsciously. It's not like people are doing this on purpose.
Right.
But for a lot of baby boomers, for most of their career, there were a lot of sacrifices that needed to be made because remote work was very limited or non-existent.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll be in focus groups with baby boomers and even Gen Xers sometimes, and they'll tell me stories about anniversary dinners that needed to be missed and missed dance recitals and birthday celebrations. And then they will say, now we've got a bunch of 22-year-olds who are like, I want to work from home and and I want all this
Right.
flexibility. Then they didn't get to have that. And so, there is this sense, it's just built into us. It is human nature that we would have to intentionally overcome this mindset that you cannot have what I have unless you go through what I went through.
Right.
And that is part.
It's a really important point because I
Yeah.
think it's very real.
It is. It is. And I think when that type of sacrifice gets overlooked and it's painted with this brush of like older people don't know how to use technology, so they don't want remote work, or older people want to make all of our lives miserable, and so they don't want remote work, that's just not a reflection of the truth. First of all, the baseline expectations for autonomy and flexibility are higher for everyone, regardless of generation. But
Yes.
I think some of those pain points have to do with the sacrifices that had to be made by a lot of older workers who were never granted the type of flexible policies that are just par for the course today.
Yeah. Or even, I might digress for a second. I want to come back to your train of thought, but my 17-year-old, she's in her senior year. She's in finals right now. And she's with her iPad in her pajamas in bed, having a study group on Zoom. And I'm like, wait a minute. We had to go meet at the library. I had to like ride my bike there or get a ride. And, come on,
I know.
you're studying. I walk into her room. She's like, yeah, this looks like you're kind of just chilling.
It does, but we should want the next generation to have things that we were denied.
For sure. For
We should
sure.
want that.
For sure. It just stirs up my past and I'm like, whoa,
Of course.
yeah.
Kind of on that vein of looking at the generations and what's going on. I will say that in this pandemic time capsule interview series, the interviews that were my most emotional were actually with Gen Xers. And I think that there were a few reasons for that. The first is that they are right in the midst of their prime earning years. So the average age of a C-suite executive in America is 56, and that's how old Gen Xers turned last year. And it's also the sandwich generation, right? The group taking care of aging parents on
Right.
one side and school-aged children on the other. And even before the pandemic, I did feel like this was a particularly precarious life stage for Gen Xers because the illnesses ailing their parents are time consuming and long lasting, chronic, very expensive. And then on the other side, it's the first generation of parents to navigate the teenage years with social media. And then you put a pandemic on top of it. And then you've got elder vulnerability on one side, you've got childcare disruptions on the other. And you've got a lot of people out there who are trying to figure out, how can I be a good leader to my people at work? How can I be a good child to my parents, and how can I be a good parent to my children? And so when we think about, is that resonating with you? Is that
You just basically described my last, 19 months of life, like
mm,
not one word less or one word extra. I mean, to the T.
I and I'm so sorry because it is just, and again, every person has their own pandemic story and their journey and
Yeah.
how this affected them and all of
Yeah.
that. But
I,
God,
I
that
I
life
often say there's no
stage.
comparative suffering. Everybody's suffering, and it's all. What are the emotions though? I don't know if this is important or not, but what are the emotions? More frustration, anger? Is it the whole spectrum?
At the beginning, it was a lot of anxiety. It was a lot of stress. It was a
Sure.
lot of parents who were very worried about, how virtual school was impacting their children. A lot of children of aging parents trying to figure out, can I keep them in these senior living
Yeah.
facilities? If I do bring them into my house, do I have the abilities or the capacity to help them in the way that they need? So it was confusion, it was stress, it was anxiety. And, then as I continued on this interview series, people are tired. I mean,
Yeah.
people are so tired and they're doing their best and they're, watching TED Talks about resiliency or whatever. And like,
Or Netflix.
yeah, right. Or they're, watching Netflix and just trying to kind of blow off steam in different ways, have that element of escapism. But it is very hard. I think in terms of workplace implications, I'll ask people, what is your manager, what have your leaders done to help you, to try to make this easier for you? And sometimes it's really simple things where I'll hear, people will be like, they allow us to do these off camera meetings and they'll encourage us all to put on headphones and like go for a walk and just get some movement, get some sunshine, get some fresh air. There were some companies that were implementing some mental health days, which was just, additional PTO to try to give people a little bit of a break, a little bit of a breather. There were things like that. And then there was some of that stuff that's just, hard to articulate, but people would just talk to me about empathetic leaders who would just call them, check in on them, see if they're doing okay. Leaders who really went out of their way to try to remove the obstacles that stood in the way of people doing the type of work that they know they're capable of. So there was so many moments of humanity that the workforce never goes back from that. Once we see each other as human people with a lot of other responsibilities and aspirations and stressors and anxieties, once we see that in each other, we never unsee it, right? There's an intimacy that is undeniable in the workplace now that I think moving forward will be a really good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that was with the Xers.
Yeah, I mean, again, all generational trends permeate everything.
Right.
It's not, I maybe approach this topic a little bit differently than some people have seen because I'm not saying everyone born between this date and this date
Sure.
is this. We're just
But they're
looking at,
trends.
yeah, we're looking at these trends of how it can give us some language to help us understand the world around us. And it gives us an interesting lens to try to figure out how the world was, how it got to where it is today, and then helps us explore where it can go from here.
And how is that impacting those entering the workforce now, literally in the middle of the pandemic with this experience on the latter half of their, let's say, if they're in university and they're graduating, where they had to go into a cohort or do a lot of things more virtually, and now they're looking to get into the workforce. What have you seen with that?
Good and bad things. The bad things I feel like are the ones that are so obvious. For those of us who entered the workplace during normal times, we think about those dynamic and productive, meaningful work relationships that we've made.
Yeah.
And primarily those happen in the white space of work. It's like you're working on a
Yeah.
project together and you guys are in the trenches together and you're up late at night and you're ordering Chinese food at midnight and whatever that is.
Right.
It's those for me, I've always traveled a lot for work and I have these road warrior stories with colleagues that I've traveled with and we're like, oh my gosh, do you remember when the flight was
got
delayed?
canceled
Whatever.
or
Those stories that exist when we are in person together.
right.
I think mentorship is going to be something really interesting because true mentorship, real mentorship is all about, seeing something in someone that they do not see in themselves.
Yeah.
And it's hard to see that kind of potential in only a virtual setting where the interactions just tend to be more formal, right? Because you're not just
Yeah.
that type of thing. And so those are some of the ways. And then there's personal things. I mean, just statistically in this day and age, people are less likely to marry their high school sweetheart or their college sweetheart. So we've got a lot of young people entering the workforce and they're single and people meet each other at work or they go out with
Sure.
work friends and they meet one of their friends, whatever that is.
Right.
And I don't think that we can't underestimate the importance of those types of relationships and those aspects that are just so human of us wanting to date and us wanting to
Yeah.
make friends and feel that sense of
Right.
belonging. And so
Right. The
I think
forging has a real tactile sensibility
yeah,
to it, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
But I will say on the there's also just really interesting things about how people coming into the workforce right now, how they use tech, the way that they've used it their whole lives. And I'll just give you like a silly personal example. But when I'm doing virtual presentations for advertising companies or tech companies where the workforce skews a little bit younger,
Right.
the chat is totally different because they have just such a more informal relationship with technology. And so the chat is blowing up and there's a ton of questions, but there's also like funny inside jokes and there's gifs and there's like all of this stuff because it's just more relaxed. And
Right.
so we have this outdated concept that real meaningful relationships cannot be forged through technology. And that isn't true. I mean, the way that younger people have grown up with the, FaceTime and a video of some sort and the comfort with it, the ease, the
Yeah.
informality.
Yeah.
We see what happens in group chats, and they're so dynamic. And young people can share amazing things in the written word in that way. And so there are things that will be lost, there will be things that are gained. And that is the case with any change that has ever happened in the workplace. There is no such thing as a truly, completely net, an only positive change.
Right.
Um,
Right. I
and
mean, there's trade-offs. And I think what you pointed to, that part of, maybe as an Xer, I'm saying, oh, you called it white space, but the spaces in between, that white space where you're connecting and you're in the trenches and, everything that you mentioned. I guess it's kind of like, I don't know if there's a metaphor, like a campfire in cyberspace where you kind of have to, recreate that water cooler on the web or, through FaceTime or Zoom or WebEx or whatever.
Yeah, and companies are getting so creative, and I think that the organizations that come out of this really ahead are the ones who are being so inventive and courageous about what the future of the workplace can really look like. Also, there are leaders who I've talked to where they can look at the past workplace with a lot of objectivity. Right now, there's just a lot of sentimental conversation about the in-person workplace and
Right.
these water cooler conversations and all of that. But I think it's also important to look at let's look at all the meaningless interactions and
Right.
the drama and the office gossip and the distractions and all of that. Like it wasn't all good. And so moving forward, there's a way to really reinvent. Some of the companies that I'm working with are doing this really interesting mix of completely remote work mixed with great collaborative tech tools, mixed with really intentional in person experiences. So it's a tech company that I'm thinking of that I'm working with where they
Right.
just did their sales team, they all did this like camping trip in the redwoods together and doing something where you have this awesome time to connect and have experiences together and build inside jokes together and forge these organic relationships. And so then when you do go back and it's a video conversation or something that's less exciting, you have that bond, that connection
Yeah.
that's forged in
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. I mean, that background of relatedness, that
Yeah.
background of experience, that shared experience is just so important. I want to shift a little bit and maybe start to come to a head here. A lot of my clients are in financial services. You spoke to one of my bigger clients in financial services, and I'm dealing with a lot of ESG. Right, I have a
Yeah.
bank in Hong Kong that I deal with. That's very important to them. And then there's the broker dealers with the advisors. How relevant is that on the retail where you're dealing with maybe a boomer and their children, millennial, and the transfer of wealth? And then you've got like TikTokers and these young investors and even advisors that are out there on social media, but you have FINRA where it's regulated
Yeah.
and there's a whole world. I would love to get some tidbits, some like 60-second insights around what's valuable for advisors to understand that, people that are using advisors, and just kind of
Yeah.
what's going on in that whole social media ecosystem.
I think in many ways, this is like the golden era to be a great financial advisor.
Oh,
First of all, whenever there are times of uncertainty, like we're in right now, people are really hungry for a plan. And so people want a plan.
yeah.
On top of that, money has gotten weirder. There's a lot of, the meme stocks and cryptocurrency. There's confusion. And on top of that, there is so much content. It's the rise of these finfluencers. And so you do have a lot of
Yeah.
not just young people, even though it is primarily young people who are exposed to tons of financial advice, unregulated financial advice.
Right.
Something that we have learned in the past in other industries is that with more content comes more confusion.
Mm.
And look at WebMD, right? When WebMD came out, there were conversations in healthcare of like, wow, maybe are we still going to need family doctors and primary care physicians if people can go online and diagnose themselves and then go to specialists? But what happened is like we all got a cold and then we Googled our symptoms and
Right. And
came back with some, like fatal disease.
right. And we have
And
meningitis or something. Right.
exactly. It created more confusion. And then we actually needed more primary care doctors. We needed more family physicians,
Yeah.
things like that. And that's where we are with the whole conversation of finance is people need people they can trust to sort through this material. It's changed what people need from advisors. There's going to be they'll have to level up in terms of sophistication. Typically, for great advisors, they're really reliant on psychology, really understanding a
Yes.
person and their risk tolerance and all of that. But now there's also, you got to have a real grasp on economics, on current events, on social media, on the dialogue around finance that's going on. And so it requires more sophistication. But again, this
Right.
is why I think the best advisors are in a perfect position because great advisors are inherently interested in this stuff. You are interested in people and you're interested in the psychology of them and their money, but you're also interested in the markets. You're interested in money. You're interested in investments and things like that. And so you can really marry those. And I think
Yeah.
that will be the sweet spot for the industry moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that that's perfect. And you're interested, for instance, we haven't gotten to it, but I was just gifted the book, The 100-Year Life by Andrew Scott.
Yeah.
I think it's been out for a while. I'm a little bit,
Yeah.
slow.
I know.
Um,
It's a great book.
but I think advisors who, plug into ideas like that and what's the latest information on cognitive decline or macular
It,
degeneration, all these.
this, again, kind of circling back to what we talked about at the beginning, advisors who are also very keyed into this conversation around lifespan and health span are in a position to capture a larger part of the market and to get more clients because it is on the mind of so many people, even
Yeah.
if it's a little bit below the surface. But we look at some of the trends with Gen Z, this sober, curious movement, more likely to be vegan than other generations, less likely to binge drink, less likely to do hard drugs. And there are so many reasons for trends like that. But one thing that is contributing to that is they have grown up with this backdrop of if you don't make time for wellness, you'll be forced to make time for illness. There's this real awakening to this concept that we've only got one body and we might have it for a very long time. And so
Yeah.
we have to think about what we put into it and how we use it. And it isn't just that, it's the investments that we make in our nourishment and in our movement, but also in our relationships, in our cognitive functioning. And I'll give you a little story of my advisor that this I just thought was great. My husband and I, it's our 5-year wedding anniversary this year. And before this Delta wave, we had this plan for an awesome trip. And it's been a while that since we've gone on a really fun trip together, since we've had like a novel experience together.
Yeah.
And we're in it. Like we're in that life stage. We've just got 2 little kids and we haven't slept in 2 years. And it's just like that moment.
2 years, 3 years. Come on.
Exactly, exactly. And so we were talking to our advisor about this trip and it was, kind of expensive. And we're like, God, should we really do this? And he was like, you could be married for a very, very long time. And you have to put investment into your relationship and feeling connected and giving yourself time to unwind together, giving yourself time to, build new memories together, to have novel experiences together. This really matters. And this
Yeah.
matters to your health and all of that. And it was kind of like almost a weird thing for an advisor to be discussing with us. But it did
Right.
have to do with money. It has to do with time investment. It has to do with opportunity costs, and it has to do with actual financial investment.
Right.
But, really looking at how strong our relationships are has such a bound impact on our health on our well-being, even on our longevity. And
Yeah.
so there are investments that need to be made in order to make sure that those stay strong throughout
Yeah.
different parts of your life.
No, thank you for sharing that. It's an intimate part of your life, but I got it. I'm a little bit of a corny dude. I got goosebumps because it's like, oh, what do you want to save up for to
Yeah,
remodel the bathroom or to go, have these? And it's not a novel experience. I would say they're deep, connecting, unique experiences just to you and your relationship. And what's interesting in the anecdote is that in cold terms, the financial advisor should be like, no, conserve and
right.
keep the money in play and you can yield more and everything. But he used the word invest in your relationship,
Yeah.
which technically means taking money out of your fund or whatever it is and utilizing it. But that really speaks to me. We just celebrated 10 years in
Oh,
September.
congratulations.
And thank you. Well, congratulations to you on 5. And we made choices, and we were lucky enough to be able to go out and do a little trip, and it was fantastic. And we still have the glow of it, and over a month and a half later, but that's important. And I think that the reason why your work and your research and these interviews that you're doing continually resonate so well with, the clients that I've brought you in for, but all the clients that you speak to and you do your work with is because the generational behaviors and understanding this holistic, the psychology, the current events, the trends, the tendencies, the economics, all of the elements of that ecosystem of life, culture, pop culture, create that context of understanding.
Yeah.
And whether it's financial advisor or a speaker bureau owner, having a context to be able to talk to your clients about why something is a fit or how to frame it is a difference maker. It really is.
I think we are always trying to find language to articulate the things that we're feeling, the things that we're observing. And to me, that is the most powerful thing about this topic is that it can just give us some language. And after presentations, what people usually will say to me is something like, I have never thought about it like that before. And that's what I want. I don't want them to say, I've never thought about that in general. I want
Right.
the research to be reflective of what people are seeing, what they're experiencing, what they're living, and to give them some context for it, some data around it, some language around it, some implications, some takeaways, because I think that we're so hungry for that and people feel so confused right now. And so if you can give them a little bit of that sense of grounding under their feet, I think that's a service.
Yeah, and you're providing it, and you're right. People are hungry. The double-edged sword is, and I've sat in many times live in the front row of your presentations, is people want the answer. And
Yeah.
what is the term you use? These are tendencies, or these are
Trends. Yeah.
trends, right? I use the word tendencies.
Implications.
These are trends. It's not hard and fast, and something could be true for both generate or more than one generation. But it's that human need to have that answer, and it's not. It's more of a general framework, and like you said, language is important, and it grounds us, and it opens up our eyes, and I think that's why I love booking you, why I love speaking with you, because it's so fascinating, and it touches on all realms, all domains of life, really. I can think of sports, politics, economics, current events. It's just really, really cool. You love what you do. It shows.
I do. I
Yeah,
do. I just
that's
think
cool.
I think people are interesting. I think culture is interesting. I think the way people impact culture and the how we are impacted by it, all of those relationships I've just always found fascinating.
If you'd like to learn more about this speaker, visit our website at thekeynotecurators.com. There you'll find dozens of videos of speakers that are a perfect fit for your event. If you'd like to reach out directly, please click on the link below in the description. My name is Seth Dechtman, and you've been watching Curated Insights.